It all started with a complaint. One of the senior parishioners of the church said that unusual words were heard from the confessional. At first, Father Michael didn't think much of it. He was a priest for 17 years. He knew that whispers, fear, guilt, and even delirium were part of confession. People come broken. But in the next 2 weeks, it happened again. Always at the same time. Always with the same 2 women. One of the assistants, an audio technician, installed a hidden microphone in the confessional booth, just to check the acoustics, just to make sure. But there was no prayer on the recording. There was no repentance. There were other words, not English, not Latin. There was a name repeated 3 times, and there was more than one voice. It overlapped, split up. It was as if someone was repeating phrases synchronously in the cockpit, but one voice was from inside, the other is from behind bars. They listened over and over again, and they realized that one of the voices did not belong to a human. The confessional sat in the oldest wing of the church, forgotten by most, shrouded in shadows, untouched by the modern renovations that had brightened the nave and brought fresh gold to the altar. It was small, closed off, surrounded by aging, wood that groaned softly in the changing temperatures. The walls held a faint trace of incense long since absorbed, and the crucifix above the booth had dulled to a near-silent presence, barely glinting in the low, ambient light. It was a place of secrets, and she always asked for that booth. She began appearing just after Lent. Every Wednesday, precisely at 3 p.m., without fail. She never missed, never spoke to anyone else, and never stayed more than 15 minutes. She wore the same long black dress, the same scarf drawn tightly over her head, concealing most of her face except for a sharp jawline and eyes that never seemed to lift from the floor. The other parishioners barely noticed her, or pretended not to. There was something about her presence that muted conversation in her vicinity. She never sat with the others during Mass. She never took communion. She walked in quietly, waited in the shadows of the side hallway, and disappeared just as easily once she had finished. Father Michael had served at St. Jerome's for 17 years, long enough to recognize when something didn't fit. He noticed her from the first week, but said nothing. It was not his place to question who came to confess, nor what they confessed. Yet he found himself unsettled after each session with her. Not because of what she said, but because of what lingered after she left. The air in the booth felt heavier. His limbs would stiffen. He found it difficult to recall what had been said. His memory faded around the edges of her visits like old tape, recorded over too many times. Once or twice, he had tried to replay the moments in his mind after she left, only to find he couldn't remember the sound of her voice. And then there were the physical changes. His hands began to tremble during Mass, only slightly at first, small, twitches barely noticeable to the congregation, but enough to cause him to drop the chalice during preparation. His vision blurred at strange times, even when his eyes were rested. There were nights when he would wake to the scent of candle smoke, though no candles had been lit in the rectory. In his dreams there was a presence, not a form, not a figure, just the sense that someone was watching him from the corner of the room, always where the shadows were deepest. He had confided in no one. There were no words for the slow dread curling its way into his bones. He told himself it was exhaustion, the weight of shepherding too many lost souls for too long. But in truth, the feeling had a shape, and that shape began at the old wooden booth where the woman in black always sat. Each week she arrived with the same deliberate pace. Her footsteps barely echoed. When she entered the booth, she did so without hesitation. She never made the sign of the cross. She never greeted him. Her confessions were low, rhythmic, and spoken in a tone that felt less like conversation and more like invocation. There were no sins, no transgressions to absolve, only statements, repeated phrases, sometimes in Latin, but often in a language he did not recognize, with cadences that seemed unnatural to the human mouth. He tried to interrupt her once. His voice caught in his throat. Another time he tried to ask her name. She said nothing, only tilted her head slightly as though considering the question, and continued. The fourth time she came, he noticed something even more disturbing. She never looked at the screen. Not once. In every confession he had heard in his career, people sought the reassurance of the priest's silhouette through the carved lattice. They leaned toward that presence, drawing comfort from the human closeness behind anonymity. But not her. She stared at the opposite wall, as if someone else was sitting beyond it, someone he couldn't see. After each session, she would leave without looking back. Father Michael would sit in silence, disoriented, palms sweating, unsure of where the last 15 minutes had gone. He began to dread Wednesdays. He began to fear the sound of her approaching footsteps on the tile floor, and most of all, he began to question something he had never dared question before: whether every soul that entered the confessional truly belonged to this world. And yet, he kept returning, because part of him believed, hoped, that perhaps it was his own weakness, his own mind unraveling after too many seasons in the dark, that the woman was simply broken, that her burden was great, that what he felt was pity, not fear. But each time she entered that booth, the line between pity and terror blurred a little more. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. The church had strict rules about confessionals: sacred space, sacred privacy. No cameras, no recordings, no witnesses. What was spoken in the booth was meant to stay there, between the penitent and God. But when the reports started coming in, whispers among the older parishioners about strange murmurs, unsettling phrases heard just outside the booth, Father Michael found himself faced with something he could no longer ignore. The complaints weren't about sin, but about the sound of something that didn't resemble any known prayer. It came from the old confessional, always at the same hour, always when the woman in black was inside. Something low and rhythmic, something almost mechanical in its consistency. He hadn't wanted to involve anyone, but Jacob, the young technician responsible for maintaining the church's outdated sound system, had overheard one of the comments after service and approached him, discreetly. Jacob offered to run a simple audio test, just to check for interference, he said. Nothing official, just a one-time thing, a maintenance routine. Father Michael agreed, but only if it was done quietly, with no mention to the diocese. Jacob installed a single concealed lavalier microphone beneath the seat of the priest's side of the booth, hidden in the wood, tied into the existing wiring that ran beneath the floorboards. It would pick up only the central compartment. The recording would overwrite itself every day. It was designed to disappear. But that evening, the system glitched. A software update froze the overwrite function. Instead of deleting the audio after 24 hours, it saved it. Jacob found the file 2 days later when doing a routine backup of Sunday's sermon. He almost deleted it, assuming it was corrupted. The timestamp didn't match any public event, and the waveform looked strange. But curiosity slowed his hand. He opened the file expecting static or environmental noise. What he heard was neither. The first part of the recording was ordinary. A creak of the confessional door, a soft shuffle of fabric, a brief silence. Then came the woman's voice, faint, deliberate. She wasn't confessing. She wasn't praying. She was repeating something, a string of words, spaced evenly, in a rhythm that suggested memorization. The language was unrecognizable, guttural at times, sharp at others like stone scraped against metal. There was no emotion in her tone, only precision. Each syllable was delivered with the cold clarity of someone reciting a vow or a contract. Jacob frowned and turned up the volume. That's when he heard the second voice. It didn't start with hers. It arrived later on top of hers. slightly behind at first, then in perfect unison. It was deeper, much deeper, and rough around the edges, like it had been dragged up from beneath the floor. It wasn't an echo. It was distinct, layered. There was no sign of vocal doubling or distortion in the audio. The second voice followed her exactly, but carried a resonance that made Jacob instinctively lower the volume. He played the file again. The voices moved together, faster now, more insistent. Then they paused, and then both said a name. A single name 3 times. The first time, softly. The second, louder. The third, in perfect synchrony. Jacob stopped the playback. He saved the file to an external drive, encrypted it, and brought it straight to Father Michael's office, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. He said nothing, only played the file. As Father Michael listened, his mouth went dry. There was no mistaking the voice of the woman, but the other. He couldn't place it. He felt it more than heard it, like a low vibration in his spine. The name spoken chilled him, not because of what it was, but because of how it felt. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't screamed. It was spoken with absolute clarity and reverence, as if calling something familiar, something expected. He replayed the final 10 seconds several times. After the third repetition of the name, there was silence. A stillness not just of absence, but of suspension, as if the room and the recording itself had stopped breathing. The last second of the file was pure quiet, but the waveform displayed a strange shape. It didn't match any ambient noise pattern. It was dense, layered, almost symmetrical. When Jacob enhanced it visually, it looked vaguely organic. Some saw an eye, others a heart. To Father Michael, it looked like a seal. He felt his chest tighten, a quiet panic rising beneath his skin. The woman had never given a name. She had never acknowledged his presence. But she had brought something with her into that booth. Or perhaps she had always been the vessel. That night, Father Michael went into the church long after it had closed. He entered the confessional alone, sat in silence, and pressed his ear to the wood where the microphone had been. He listened not for sound, but for presence. He waited until the candles burned low, until the air grew heavy. He heard nothing, but something heard him. Father Michael had sat in that confessional booth more times than he could count. He knew the texture of the wood beneath his fingers, the creak of the seat, the way the filtered light dimmed around midday and cast long bars of shadow through the slats of the dividing screen. It was a space built for anonymity, meant to make a priest a vessel, present but unseen. But lately the space felt distorted, as if its function had been reversed, as if something behind the screen was watching him instead. He tried to tell himself it was stress. He hadn't been sleeping well. His appetite had thinned to nothing, and the pressure in his temples had become a near constant presence. But these physical symptoms paled in comparison to the sense that he was no longer alone in that booth, not just when she arrived, but long after she had gone. There were moments, especially in the minutes before her arrival, when he would sit in silence and feel the air around him contract. Like the chamber between them was filling up with something unseen, something that listened too closely. He began paying more attention to her behavior. She never looked toward him. Her eyes always settled forward or downward, her hands folded, her voice calm. But it wasn't a penitent's stillness. It was more like the focus of someone rehearsing, as though she were delivering a report to a superior presence that resided not behind the screen, but beyond it. The words she spoke rarely changed. They had a liturgical quality, devoid of emotion, yet precise, as if she were feeding a litany into a mouth not her own. He tried to identify the language. Sometimes it felt like a broken Latin, other times like a fabricated tongue entirely. But what disturbed him most wasn't the content. It was her orientation. She wasn't speaking to him. She never had been. One afternoon, shortly after the latest recording incident, he did something uncharacteristic. He arrived an hour before her usual visit and sat, not in his side of the booth, but in hers. He wanted to feel what she felt, see what she saw. The seat was slightly lower, the angle of the wood different, the wall before her bare except for the shadow of a crucifix just out of direct line of sight. The moment he sat down, the booth felt colder, not in temperature but in atmosphere, denser, as if the air had weight. He leaned forward, placing his face where hers would have been. During confession, aligning his sight with the center of the lattice. He expected to see the faint blur of the opposing seat, the shadowed back wall. Instead, for the briefest second, he saw movement. A flicker. A shift in the shadows. Not behind the lattice, but within it, like the space between the carved wood. Slats had changed, just slightly, revealing a depth that shouldn't have been there. He blinked, leaned closer. Nothing. Just the booth as he had always known it. But the moment clung to him like a smell he couldn't scrub from his clothes. He rose, heart pounding, and returned to his side of the booth. When she arrived that day, her entrance was slower, more deliberate, as if she sensed the shift in routine. She sat down quietly, adjusted her scarf, and remained still. The silence between them stretched longer than usual. Father Michael waited. She said nothing. Then, slowly, she turned her head, not toward the screen, but just beyond it. Her eyes locked onto the corner of the booth he had never paid much attention to, the point where the wall met the ceiling. She didn't speak. She simply stared. Then, her lips moved. Not with words. With something else. A shape. A breathless formation that reminded him more of mouthing than speech. A whisper without sound. And still she stared at that corner, her face void of expression. He couldn't look away. His palms went slick, a cold, prickling sensation rising along his spine. And then it happened. He heard breathing. Not hers. Not his. It came from behind. Him, just above his shoulder. A long, slow inhalation, followed by silence. The sound was real. It vibrated in his chest. He turned instantly. There was nothing there. But the sensation didn't leave. It lingered, echoing in the drum of his ears. He returned his gaze to the lattice. She was gone. Not physically. She was still sitting there, but gone in presence. Her posture had shifted. She was slouched forward now, chin low, hair loose beneath her scarf, as if she had passed into a different state of being. She began to speak again, the language now fluid and fast, pouring from her lips like a recitation she had been waiting to release. He didn't understand the words, but he felt them move through him. His chest tightened. His vision dimmed at the edges. He could feel each syllable land in his bones like distant thunder. Then she stopped. She stood, smoothed her dress, and left without a word. He remained in the booth long after she had gone, unable to move, every nerve electrified. He no longer questioned if something else had been in that space with them. He knew. The question now was whether it had ever truly left, or if, perhaps, it never would. The idea to install a camera came not from fear, but from necessity. Or so Father Michael told himself, after the audio recording, after the breath he had heard with no one behind him, after the whisper that never touched the air but still reached his bones, he could no longer pretend. There was something happening in the booth, and it was no longer confined to sound. He wanted to believe it was psychological, a projection of his exhaustion, a residue of grief and overwork. But each week the presence returned stronger, more defined. What he once dismissed as vague disturbance now had edges. It had texture, and it had begun to follow him. He didn't go through the diocese. He didn't file paperwork or seek counsel. He simply went to Jacob again, the technician who had first set up the microphone. Jacob was reluctant. He reminded Father Michael of the risks, the violations of trust, the sacredness of the space. But the priest's face was pale, and his voice was no longer confident. It trembled with something old and buried. That was enough. The setup was discreet, a tiny lens tucked behind a loose stone in the molding above the confessional arch. It pointed not at the woman, but toward the shared central space of the booth. The lattice screen, the interior geometry, the space where sound had shifted into something more. They left it recording, passive, silent. Father Michael avoided looking at the footage for days. Part of him feared it wouldn't show anything, that it would confirm his mind was fraying. But a deeper part feared the opposite, that it would show too much. When he finally opened the first file, it began like all the others, low-resolution footage of an empty booth, faint dust particles drifting in shafts of daylight. Stillness. Then, at 2:58 p.m., movement. The woman entered slowly, with the same ritualistic cadence she always carried. She sat, adjusted her scarf, and waited. The camera timestamp blinked into 3:00 p.m. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then the light changed. It was not dramatic. It did not flare or flicker. But suddenly, subtly, the camera brightness increased. Not because the image had been digitally altered, but because the space inside the booth had grown brighter. The light source did not come from any lamp or fixture. It emanated from the space itself. It seemed to glow not on her, but around her. A pale, ambient bloom, like the air had turned bioluminescent. She lifted her head and began to speak. Her lips moved slowly, deliberately. Her hands remained folded in her lap. But what left her mouth, at least on the footage, didn't seem to match her breath. There was no physical effort, no tension in her neck or jaw. The words, if they were words, unfolded as though from somewhere else, funneled through her without obstruction. Then something strange happened. As she continued, the light around her began to pulse, very faintly, not in rhythm with her voice, but in counterpoint to it. The brighter the pulse, the softer her tone. The more intense her language became, the dimmer the light grew, as if the space were recoiling or reacting. It was not an electrical phenomenon. There were no devices nearby, no sources that could account for the glow. The camera lens briefly fogged. When it cleared, the screen showed a moment that would later become seared into Father Michael's memory. For one frame, just a flicker in time, the woman's head tilted sharply to the side, and her face, for a split second, looked directly into the lens. Her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch, but her eyes, previously distant and unfocused, locked with the unseen viewer. It was as if she had always known she was being watched and had been waiting for the watcher to see. After that, her body stilled. The light dimmed. She rose and exited, but the booth remained bright. Even after she left, the glow persisted for several minutes. The space she had occupied held its own illumination, flickering slightly like heat waves on asphalt. When Jacob paused the footage to enhance a still, the software struggled to render the light. It interpreted it not as glow, but as shape. A shape with a faint center and soft, symmetrical rings radiating outward. It looked almost like an iris. Father Michael watched that clip a dozen times. The more he watched it, the more he noticed something else. In the quiet stillness after she had gone, the lattice screen between the booths subtly shifted. The carved wood, aged and unchanged for decades, seemed to stretch inward, only slightly, but enough to suggest that the space on the other side had deepened. The camera shut off at 3:15 p.m., automatically, silently, as programmed. But as the screen faded to black, for one frame only, the system captured a fragment of the confessional. An interior, completely empty, yet still flooded with that impossible light. No one ever turned that light on. No one ever turned it off, and still, it returned. Father Michael had prepared for the meeting with all the solemnity of a sacrament. He set the chairs at a modest angle in the rectory's side study, No desk between them, no formality to enforce roles. He placed a single cup of water on the table. He left the door open, as if the space itself needed the permission to breathe. And still, despite every effort to make it ordinary, the air inside the room felt wrong. Not hostile. Worse than that. Familiar. As though the presence from the booth had followed him, slipped through the wall, and now waited invisibly behind the drapes or beneath the floor. The woman arrived without sound. He hadn't heard the knock. She simply appeared in the doorway, dressed as always in black, her scarf drawn snugly under her chin. Her hands were clasped in front of her, not in reverence but with the quiet tension of someone who has already decided the outcome of a conversation. Her gaze met his briefly, calm, unreadable, and then drifted to the far corner of the room. She sat with no hesitation. He opened his mouth to speak, but she was already moving. From the folds of her coat, she withdrew a small folded paper and placed it carefully on the table between them. Her eyes didn't return to his. Instead, she looked toward the doorway, as if expecting someone else to arrive. He reached for the note with trembling fingers. It was simple, worn, creased in half as if it had been opened and closed many times. On it, in handwritten Latin, were 4 words. Confiteor, sed non tibi. I confess, but not to you. He looked up, heart hammering, but she was already rising. She offered no farewell, no parting glance. As she turned and walked out, her shoes made no sound on the old tile. The scent she left behind reminded him faintly of candle wax and parchment. Dry, brittle, sacred. He sat alone with the paper, turning it over again and again in his hands, as if expecting more to be revealed. But the message was clear. Her confessions were never meant for him. He had not been the recipient. He had only been permitted to overhear, if even that. That night he returned to the booth. Not during confession hours, not even with the intention to pray. He simply sat. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't speak. He allowed the silence to surround him like water, pressing against his ears, muting the world outside. For a while, nothing happened, but then he felt it again, the slow constriction of space, as if the wooden walls were drawing closer. The air grew still, too still, the way it gets in a room before a storm hits. And then, a voice. Not hers. Not his. It came from the other side of the screen, low, dry, flat. Not threatening. Not mocking. But ancient. It spoke in the same rhythm as hers, though in a language he could not place. It was not Latin. It was not any known tongue. It was sound stripped of humanity. A vocal architecture that bypassed the ear and went straight to the body. The lattice between the booths began to quiver, not from wind or vibration, but as though reacting to the sound, responding to it. He remained frozen, every part of him on fire with a stillness that was not peace, but paralysis. The voice did not demand a reply. It did not acknowledge him. It simply continued. And then, midway through the chant, it changed. It began to speak in his voice. Not perfectly, not like a recording, but close enough that he felt his stomach twist. It repeated words he hadn't said aloud in years, phrases from childhood, prayers he had learned at seminary, a confession he had once made in private, long buried. He sat in horror as the voice spoke with intimate knowledge of his sins, not just the acts, but the thoughts that had never become actions. It wasn't reading his past, it was peeling it open, unthreading his life before him, syllable by syllable. And then, silence. He rose and stumbled out of the booth, barely able to breathe. His legs carried him not to the altar, not to his room, but outside, into the cold air, beneath the stars. There he stood, trembling, mouth open, trying to summon any prayer at all. None came. He didn't return the next day, or the one after, but the recordings continued. The camera, still connected to Jacob's silent server, captured the booth every afternoon. and though no one entered, the light sometimes flickered. The sound meters would spike faintly, too low to be audible, but always at 312, and the voice, when it returned, no longer needed a human shape to speak. The confessional booth remained closed for weeks after Father Michael left. Officially, he was on leave, spiritual exhaustion, personal renewal, the kinds of phrases churches used when silence was more convenient than explanation. No one asked questions. Those who had grown uneasy about the old booth were relieved to see the curtain drawn over its entrance. The parish went on. Services resumed. New hands lit the candles. But the booth, though still, was not forgotten. Jacob continued to monitor the system he had installed, though he never admitted this to anyone. Something in him refused to let it go. The camera was no longer scheduled to record, but every day, at 3:00 p.m., he manually activated it, letting it capture precisely 15 minutes of stillness. No one had entered the booth since the woman had vanished. She never returned. No one knew her name. No one had seen her again, not on the church grounds, not in the surrounding streets. It was as if she had evaporated, leaving no trace beyond, the weight she left behind in memory. But the booth was not empty. On the footage, the first few days showed nothing. Still wood, pale light from stained glass, shadows that shifted slightly with the movement of the sun. But then the anomalies began. Quiet, small, almost deniable. A pulse in the brightness, a faint shimmer that moved across the grain of the wall as though light was bending in ways it shouldn't. The microphone, though disabled, began to register faint hisses on its raw feed. No words, just pressure. The kind of pressure one feels when standing in an elevator descending too fast, or in a room where someone else is watching from just behind the doorway. Then came the movement. On the 7th day of recording, at exactly 3:12 p.m., the grain pattern on the central panel of the booth twisted slightly, just enough to be caught in 3 frames. It returned to normal instantly, but Jacob saw it. He replayed it dozens of times. It wasn't a glitch. The camera hadn't jerked. The booth itself had shifted, like the wood had inhaled. When he ran the footage through a light analyzer, the data showed that during that same frame sequence the booth had absorbed light instead of reflecting it, as if the darkness inside had thickened into something with form. He didn't tell the parish. He didn't dismantle the equipment. Instead, he began saving each day's footage to a private drive. He watched the recordings alone, headphones on, the sound muted as if somehow that would lessen the impact. But with each new file, the tension grew, not in the content, but in the feeling that the booth knew, that it was waiting. On the 20th day, the feed captured something else. The booth was empty, as always. The woman had not returned. No one had entered. But at 3:13 p.m., the lattice screen between the two sides darkened. Not from shadow, not from lighting. It became black, not visually, but conceptually. Like a window had opened into a place that did not reflect, did not emit, did not allow interpretation. And then, slowly, something passed in front of the screen. No shape, just a disturbance. A bending of space like heat rising from pavement, except cold. For 3 seconds, the timestamp flickered. Then it returned to normal. That night, Jacob left. The church with the drive in his pocket and a feeling in his chest he could not name. When he passed the booth on the way out, he paused. The curtain had shifted, just slightly. Only enough to see the corner of the bench inside, but he hadn't touched it. He drove home in silence. He didn't sleep. Instead, he opened the drive and began rewatching the clips from the beginning, one by one, chronologically. When he reached the final file, the one from that afternoon, he paused it on the last frame. The booth, empty, still. But in the far corner of the screen, barely visible, was the reflection of something on the surface of the polished wood, something that did not belong to the geometry of the room. It was not a figure, not a face. It was more like an outline, a gap where something should have cast no shadow, but somehow had, a place where the eye could not focus. And Jacob, sitting in the cold light of his desk lamp, realized what had been happening. The booth had not been the origin. It had been the invitation. The woman had only been the mouth. And now, with her gone, it had learned to speak without her. The confessional remained closed. But at 3:12, every day the light still changed, and someone, something, still waited inside.